So that brings up, I think, an objection. So let's talk about a hard question here. So we're saying that Jesus is God becoming man. He's taking on human flesh. But we're also saying that he's still God, right? But that brings up a problem. Doesn't it seem like God and man are just too different, right? Like we're just too different than each other for somebody to be both God and man. You could put it this way, like God is unlimited, human beings are limited, therefore God becoming man is impossible. How can somebody be both unlimited and limited at the same time? Seems like a lot of non-contradiction would preclude that. What would you guys say to something like that?
Framed that way, I get it, but I'm not sure what the contradiction is if a one person sharing two distinct natures, a divine nature and a human nature. I don't know what the contradiction is there. So I'm not sure that there is a logical contradiction in the notion of one person having two natures, divine and human. It's of course not common, but I'm not sure what, and it's not very comprehensible in
Mhm.
many ways. But I'm not quite clear that there is actually a logical contradiction there. Actually, I'm sure there's not, but I can't even.
Yeah. Well, and I believe there isn't either, but let's make sure we're addressing the question as best as we can. So let me give an example. So, uh, God has no weaknesses, right? He has no deficiencies.
Mhm.
He's only morally perfect. He's only perfect in every way. But human beings have weaknesses, right? Like Jesus got sleepy, he got hungry, he got tired, he needed all sorts of things. He has needs. um how can God, the unlimited one that has no needs, no weaknesses, have weaknesses and needs? How do those two go together?
Yeah, I think that passage you referenced in Philippians, where it talks about that though Jesus was in nature God, he did not. I like a paraphrased translation of this rather than quoting it literally, because I think the best way to understand that verse is that Jesus did not consider his divinity something that he could exploit for selfish gain.
Hmm.
And I think what that shows us is that in this, um, Jesus having the divine and the human nature in his humanity, he would grow weak because that's what humans do. And Jesus did not use his divinity in an exploitive way of that situation, such that it would mean that he never really got to experience what the human experience was. And if that were the
Hmm.
case, he would not be a good high priest like Hebrews talks about us, because he would never have truly been tempted and experienced the weakness and the frailty of humanity. So I think a way to understand this is that Jesus, having both a human and a divine nature, he never he never exploited his divine nature for selfish gain, but surrendered it willingly, such that he would experience um, the fullness of what it is to be human. And that's necessary for the reasons that we'd talked about, thus being the perfect sacrifice, but also then in his role as being a faithful priest that truly does understand us in our weakness and in our temptation.
Hmm.
Right, so I think the key part of this is understanding the 2 natures, that the 2 natures exist, right? So people will often say, "Well, if Jesus is God, then when Jesus died on the cross, there's no more God, like, God didn't exist for those, like, 3 days he was dead," type thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, it's like, so God is dead, so that doesn't make any sense. What happened to the world? How did the world keep spinning? Or, how did everything not fall apart without God overseeing everything or whatever, right? So this is where the 2 divine natures, piece, I think, is key, because you understand that the human part dies for sure, but God himself, God, like the supernatural being, this being that is beyond flesh, didn't somehow just cease existing for those 3 days, and
Hmm.
so this human aspect of him, yes, absolutely, I think it experienced weakness, I think it experienced all the things that we experience as humans. And I think, as Mike said, this is what also is there's also a meaning in this. It seems like everything is like there's a point in a meeting tonight. Seems like what we're doing a lot of, right? The fact that he did take on those weaknesses and did do life as a human means that he can therefore then comfort us in anything we're going through, because he actually knows what it's like to be us. So it adds in that other aspect where he experienced all of the human things. And a lot of times people say things to me like, well, I used to, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but they'll say, well, because Jesus, that means that God went to the bathroom. And I'm like, I didn't know going to the bathroom was like an evil thing. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. Like, and
Mm.
and so sometimes we think of things certain, like so much of humanness is foul, but there's actually so much humanness that is also good as well, that Jesus also went through with us, loves and relationships and friendships and laughing and certain things. And I mean, he also did those, tasting good food, and these aren't like, it's not like God didn't know what these things were before, but I'm just saying in every aspect of our humanity, Jesus partook. And so that aspect means that we are then talking to a God who actually knows and understands us. And
Mm.
not just in yeah, I know what it feels like to be you, but actually I was you. And so I think that when you understand it as two natures, which it is possible, obviously, I'm guessing with Mike, it is possible that and I do believe it's true that there are two natures within Jesus. And I think we see aspects of that even in the world around us. So I think humans don't have two natures, right? But we do have this this sense of being an essential being, but also being a person. Okay, so we are something that exists, but we're also a person. But if I was to pick up a pen, I could say it's got substance to it. It is a thing, just like I am a thing. I'm a being that exists, but there's no personhood to it, right? So there is a sense in which a pen doesn't have any kind of personhood. I have a personhood, so I'm already different than the pen, and God is just one more degree different than that. He's got two personhoods. Well, not sorry, God has three personhoods. Excuse me. So this idea of Jesus being two parts, I think, human and divine, can make sense when we're talking about God exists in a form that is different than us.
Yeah, very, very well said. I think too, just thinking about, God being all powerful, I think it's actually a strength of his that he can choose to voluntarily give up certain things or limit his access to certain things. So it's almost like saying, well, adults don't crawl, right? Adults don't crawl. Well, unless an adult chooses to humble himself to crawl with a child,
Right.
to teach
Exactly.
that child how to crawl. So adults still can do those lower things, those things that they cease to do when they become adults. But it requires humbling. It requires a limiting of their capabilities. It requires saying, you know what, I'm going to voluntarily choose not to exercise my ability to walk in this moment, and I'm going to crawl next to this child. And I think there are different models, without going too deep into the weeds on this, to kind of explain how Jesus can limit certain things. So, for example, God is omniscient, right? He knows everything. He is omnipresent. He's everywhere, right? So, is Jesus omniscient and is he omnipresent? Well, let's take the omniscience, for example. It seems like Jesus doesn't know some things. Like he says he doesn't know the day or the hour when God's going to return, right? Is that a problem for us? Well, there's ways of understanding that actually help us to kind of resolve that. So, for example, there are different models where you look at this as limiting awareness. So, for example, I know how to do algebra, but I'm not thinking about algebra right now until I brought up the subject. And so I have pre-conscious access to algebra, but I'm not actively exercising that. So Jesus has, let's call it this pre-conscious access to all the facts in the universe, but he chooses through his omnipotence, through his power, to limit it and to be able to experience exactly what we were talking about earlier of a real human life, what it's really like to be in that moment, to be in that state, to be growing, to learn all of the things that we experience. To actually experience those things, Jesus limits himself and limits his access to those things. And I think that helps to kind of resolve a lot of the questions and a lot of the problems that we think about when it comes to what it means for God to be in human flesh.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to put it, Matthew. That's really helpful. And I don't know why it's hard. It's when you put it that way, of course, or use that idea to explain it. I don't know why it's hard to think about God being able to do that.
Mm.
And just real quick, I don't like how sloppy I was with the paraphrase when I referenced Philippians chapter 2.
Okay.
It's Philippians chapter 2, and in particular, verses 5 through 7. Let me just read it here real quick.
Sure.
It says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped." That's the phrase that it's difficult to translate fully what it means into English. But though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's where it's like he did not consider his divinity a thing to be held on to for his own advantage. And so that's where we get into this
Yeah.
limiting idea. And he did that, and he surrendered the right to fully exercise the fullness of his divinity to really kind of live a faux humanity, a fake human life. And we're grateful for that because Jesus knows what suffering is. It's interesting. He also knows experientially what moral growth is and how suffering produces that. Again, from a propositional standpoint, God understands moral growth perfectly, exactly how it works. But in his humanity, he knows what perseverance is. And so there is great hope in that, right? Because a lot of times when we face hardship, we don't understand the why. We do know part of the reason why we face hardship is because without it, moral growth is literally not possible. Jesus knows exactly what that process is like. And so it's really comforting to, in the midst of hardship, when you will never have all the whys answered for you, you at least know my God knows every bit what I'm going through, and I can trust him in the midst of this.